I think it's the most serious challenge we've ever faced. And that's what I'm trying to wake my colleagues up. And like I say, James, everybody's treating this as politics as usual. You know, they say, well, King is just trying to undermine Trump, or Schumer's trying to undermine Trump. This is a qualitatively different situation than an argument about immigration or voting rights or guns or whatever it is. By the way, James, if anybody asked you, which they asked me when I was running last year, you should tell them you're a year younger than Mick Jagger. That worked. That worked for me, man. And so
we have one of the most interesting guests in American politics, the senator from Maine, Angus King. Senator, in a reprise of Maine's Margaret Chase Smith famous Declaration of Conscience 75 years ago, you issued yours. I've read it now twice, and you said quite directly, Donald Trump is violating the Constitution and the rule of law, brushing aside separation of powers. Congress, the United States Senate, could stop some of this. Yet, as you say, it has been complicit. Why?
Well, you know the answer to that. You guys know a lot about politics. This is all about Republican primaries. And my colleagues, I think part of the problem, Al, is that people around here are looking on this as just politics as usual. You know, this is the usual pushing and hauling between the administration, the president, and the Congress. And, you know, we're arguing about immigration and various issues that have been around for a long time. The problem is they're ignoring the fact that there's something much deeper and more serious that's going on, which is this whole unitary executive idea and the idea that the president basically has all the power. It's very telling that this president has only signed 5 bills in the first 100 days. I mean, that used to be the measure of how much legislation. And I ran across an amazing thing online the other day where he was just going on and on criticizing Obama for signing executive orders and saying this shows he can't get anything done. Well, they've done nothing but executive orders. One substantive bill, the Riley-Lakin Act, not a very good one, and then the continuing resolution, and 3 CRA's Congressional Review Act. So basically, practically no legislative output. The problem, fellas, is this is exactly what the framers of the Constitution were worried about. When you get all power into one set of hands, it's dangerous. It's dangerous for everybody. And it's dangerous for the people that are egging on the president right now. At some point, they're going to say, wait a minute, we didn't really mean for him to be able to deport people because what's on their Facebook page or whatever next is going to be next after tattoos. This is a fundamental collapsing of our structure of checks and balances. And as I say, it's just plain dangerous for the American people. And I'm trying to sound the alarm. My wife says I'm a combination of Paul Revere and Chicken Little. I'm trying to get people to pay attention to this problem. But right now, the loyalty to party is overcoming loyalty to the Constitution.
We'll stick with the Paul Revere. We have been promoting a wonderful article that came out today in the Atlantic by Judge Michael Ludig, a conservative icon, and it is entitled, Senator, "The End of the Rule of Law in America." I mean, to have a conservative jurist say there is the end of the rule of law, and he says that almost every major signature thing that Trump has done is unconstitutional. That's stunning. And I want to ask you, you've always been a come let us reason together guy. You work with people on both sides of the aisle. You're an independent. But now is the time to really get a lot tougher, a lot meaner. Chuck Schumer, for instance, says that he's going to hold up all of his DOJ nominees until he explains or gives in on accepting that $400 million airplane. I mean, are there things that you guys can do that'll make it harder for him?
Well, there are things that can be done, but, you know, you guys know American politics. They have the votes. There are procedural things, for example, holding up nominees. And by the way, there was a debate on the floor yesterday where one of my Republican colleagues was saying, this is unheard of. We've never done anything like this in 50 years. Well, what about Tommy Tuberville and the generals? I mean, you know, that was a straight up obstruction for no good reason. But yeah, there are things that can be done. But ultimately, it's the Republicans who have to step up and honor the oath that they took to the Constitution. And it's all right. Now, a couple of things might happen or will happen, I think. The president's going to overreach. And finally, it's going to start impacting people at home. When the first Social Security check is late, or people can't get through to the VA to get a medical appointment because they've cut the staff so thoroughly, when those kinds of things start happening back home, then the senators here, the legislators, the congressmen people are going to start to say, well, wait a minute, this isn't going to help me, a year and a half from now. I'm going to have to start separating myself. And I'm seeing that starting to happen. We had a bipartisan bill with, I think, 7 or 8 Republican co-sponsors on bringing the tariff power back to the Congress. That was I would call it a green shoot, a kind of early indication that maybe this lockstep following of whatever the president wants to do is starting to wear a little thin with these folks.
Let me, did Trump blink on tariffs this week with China?
Looked to me like it. I mean, that was my question is, aren't we pretty much back where we were 6 months ago? And it was sort of a double blink, if you will. Perhaps that isn't the right word, but the tariffs sort of went back to, as I say, where they were before all this started. And then, but to make it worse, he said, well, this is for 90 days. And that's what businesses don't like, is the uncertainty. If they're going to make a deal, let's make a deal and get it done. I spent a lot of my life in private business. You want to know what the rules are a year from now and 2 years from now, let alone a couple of weeks from now. So the fact that he made this, whatever the deal is with China, it doesn't appear to be, as I say, anything very significant in terms of where we already were. But then he wants to, he stretches it out and gives us another 90 days of uncertainty. The whole tariff thing is a good example as to why the framers put the tariff power in Congress's hands and not one person's hands. And unfortunately, Congress delegated it, but only for emergencies. And of course, he's called anything he wants an emergency. I can tell you, from a state next to Canada, there's no emergency at the Canadian border.
You're not worried about the Canadian Mounties coming over and attacking Bangor.
Well, there is a concern that they'll come across the border and be nice and give us free health care. I mean, you got to be careful of that.
Let me go back to the corruption for a minute. That airplane, $400 million for his presidential use and then his personal use from Qatar. They'll get something for that. I mean, doesn't this have the appearance of a bribe?
I don't know if I'd use that word, but I'd certainly say it has the appearance of an illegal gift. The Constitution is very clear. The president can't accept a gift from a foreign state without the approval of Congress. And this is the mother of all gifts, $400 million. But listen, there's a big national security issue here. Imagine for a minute if the Qataris came and said, we'd like to remodel the Oval Office, the Situation Room, and the residence at the White House, and we're going to rewire it and remodel it. We'd say, you're out of your mind. We can't allow you to do that. Well, that's what Air Force One is. It's a combination of the Situation Room, the Oval Office, and the residential. And in order to accept this, if we have any sense, we'd have to practically take that plane apart to be sure that it's not bugged in some way. This is the same country that supports Hamas. You know, the Hamas leadership that isn't in Gaza is in Qatar, and it smells bad on all fronts. And of course, it's people don't give you a $400 million gift and expect nothing in return.
Let me ask just one more and turn over to James. You in that speech that you gave on almost the 75th anniversary of Margaret Chase Smith, which you knew, you actually did a documentary on her. But you also talked about the actions that he's taking against private companies, the media and the law firms, which are virtually unprecedented and outrageous. But those big New York and Chicago law firms capitulated. They could have stood up like Wilmer Hale and others, maybe cut their bonuses in half. I mean, when you talk about profiles and cowardice, don't you have to add those big law firms?
Well, I think they made a big mistake. You never get anywhere, sitting on top of the tiger. You're going to get eaten in the end. And I think what they thought was they thought, well, he wants a commitment for pro bono work. We already do a lot of pro bono work, so that's sort of a no big deal. What they didn't realize is he expects pro bono work that he defines. Mm-hmm. of what he asks, and it was it was a terrible mistake for those firms to do that, and I think it was a terrible mistake for Columbia University to fold. The old saying in Maine is if you give a moose a cookie, what's going to happen? You're going to run out of cookies pretty soon. And this guy's just going to keep coming back and coming back. But let me take it back a little bit, Al, and talk about why this is so serious. Article 2 of the Constitution is very limited. That's what defines the presidential power. He only has one unilateral power in Article 2. That's the power of pardons. Nobody can check that. Everything else, even commander-in-chief in war, Congress has the power to declare war. All the other powers of appointing judges and everything else are subject to congressional control. But here's the key that really, you get to the law firm stuff, the university stuff, the collapsing of agencies. The principal responsibility in the Constitution in Article 2 of the president says he has the responsibility to, quote, see that the laws are faithfully executed. Period. Not see that the laws he likes are faithfully executed. And by the way, an appropriations bill is a law. It's not something that the president can pick and choose and say, well, I like this program, I'm going to fund it. I don't like this one, I'm going to cut it. That's not the way the whole thing is designed for a reason. Because these people knew in 1787 that it was dangerous for any individual to have all the power. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's 1,000 years of human nature talking to us.
It sure is. James Carville.
So, Senator King, the saying is there's a new senorita coming to town, and her name is Rosie Scenario.
Yeah.
And if you look at the whole Build Back Better, or what they're doing, and I'm going to bring up a term we don't talk about very much more, is the debt and the deficit. Unchecked, where are we heading to? What kind of, if they pass these tax cuts and they pass the stuff that they're talking about, don't you, being a kind of Yankee, kind of skeptical look at things, does the deficit starting to play into your thinking about the future of the country? And can this stuff really, really come back and, frankly, just bite us on the ass?
Absolutely, James. And where we are is we're approaching, and I think we've actually exceeded 100% of our GDP as our debt. That's sort of a red flag. And you talked about Rosie Scenario. I don't know if you're aware, but the Republicans in the Senate changed the rules, and they said all these Trump tax cuts expire this year. So current law has always been the way you define spending and tax bills. What's current law? So current law is they're going to expire, and if they extend them, it's going to, on the books, will cost $4.5 trillion. So they've invented something new called current policy. And what they're saying is that extending what's current policy, even though it expires at the end of the year, is a sort of magical way of saying it's not going to cost anything. I mean, I'm not making this up.
No.
It's a fantasy in terms of arithmetic, because we're still going to have to borrow the money. The short answer to your question is it's a serious problem. There are lots of pieces to it, but one of the pieces, fellas, is revenues. The average of federal revenues over the past 30 or 40 years is around 20% of GDP. And expenditures have been around 21 or 22% of GDP. That's the deficit. Now, revenues are something like 16% of GDP as a result of the Bush and the Trump tax cuts. And that's the big, huge deficit. 5%, 6% of GDP is a big number. And you add it up every year. And interest in I think next year or the year after, interest on our debt will exceed the defense budget. That's dead money. That's not money that's buying anything for the American people. In fact, a lot of it's going overseas. So the answer is yes, it's a serious problem, but I'm troubled by the idea that the only way to solve it is to drastically cut spending. And I got to add one thing, and I know I'm talking too much. Firing a lot of federal workers doesn't save much in the way of money. That's a show. You could fire 1/3 of all federal workers and reduce the federal budget by 1%. So this whole Doge thing is fake.
So, Senator, what they're proposing, the analogy that I use, let's say I send my daughter to Bowdoin College in May. It's very expensive, okay? So I'm planning, let's just for the
I
sake
used
of
to I used to teach there, James, so she'll
Easy
get a hell
peasy.
of an education.
Okay, I'll see this. So let's pay up. Let's say I I'm paying $70,000 times 4 is $280,000. So my daughter graduates, and she said, "Dad, give me 70. Now just keep giving me $70,000 a year because I just graduated, so you don't do that. So it doesn't really cost you anything
Yeah.
if every 4 years you give me 200. That's the logic of what they're saying.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I've confronted them about it on the floor, and they just sort of smile and roll their eyes, and they know it's nonsense what they're doing.
Right, but we just got to explain to people how much nonsense this is, because they'll use well, according to current policy, if you add, and they'll just obfuscate it. So what you're saying is, I got to keep paying my children the same amount of money I paid them to send to school, or I finished paying my mortgage, I ought to just keep paying because it really doesn't cost me.
Yeah, that's a good way to analogize it. That's exactly the argument. And listen, I'm not sitting here saying you got to raise taxes, but I'm saying you can't talk about this subject because here's the other thing about the budget. I'm gonna bore you for a minute.
No, Boris.
Domestic spending, domestic discretionary spending, Department of the Interior, Agriculture, Justice, all the stuff you think of as a federal government is absolutely flat for the past 60 years as a percentage of GDP. It's about 4% of GDP back in the 60s, 4% of GDP today. Defense, and this will surprise you, defense spending as a percent of GDP has gone down from 9% to about 3%. So defense spending as a proportion of our economy has gone down almost 2/3. People are surprised to hear that. They always talk about we spend more than any other country, all the other countries combined, but it's way less than we were spending back in the 60s and 70s. Where the growth in the budget is, of course, is in what are called mandatory spending: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, federal health care costs, veterans costs. That's what's driving the budget, and what's driving that is mostly health care, because we spend twice as much per capita as anybody in the world for health care, and that's what's driving that deficit. Back in the 60s and 70s, the discretionary budget that Congress controlled was about 70% of the total budget. Today, it's flipped. The discretionary budget is 30% of the federal budget, and 70% is in the so-called entitlements. Why are the entitlements so high? Number one is healthcare, as I mentioned. The other is demographics. 10,000 people a day are qualifying for Medicare. I mean, think about that for a minute. So the demographics are driving it too. And, this is a complicated problem that we need to look at spending for sure. But as I say, firing a bunch of federal workers is only going to compromise services, and it isn't going to save a hell of a lot of money. And you can't talk about this without talking about revenues.
How essential is Medicaid to the health insurance profile in the state of Maine? What would happen if we just eradicated it?
It would be catastrophic. Something like 250 to 300,000 people would lose their coverage overnight. And a lot of people think of Medicaid as, for moms on welfare with little kids. But 70% of the nursing home beds in Maine are paid for by Medicaid. 70%. So you're talking about Aunt Minnie and your mother and, your Uncle Charlie. And that's a huge part of the Medicaid budget. Kids are a big part of it. And frankly, you guys are the political analysts. I've never understood why there are certain people in this country that seem hell-bent to take health insurance away from people. I just don't get it. I don't understand the ideology. I feel very strongly about it. My life was saved because I had health insurance and had an early intervention and found cancer and was treated. And if I hadn't had that health insurance, I wouldn't be here today. So the idea of taking health insurance away from people it's cruel, number one, but it's also bad policy. Healthy people are able to work and pay taxes.
There's a book called "The Cruelty is the Point." That's actually the point, is that it's cruel. Don't ever underestimate that.
Well, some of the things that are going on, cutting AmeriCorps. I mean, here thousands of young people that are volunteering, working public service. They don't get paid much at all, so it's a very low cost. But they're eliminating it. Why? Because they don't like public service, I guess. I mean, it's as you say, cruelty seems to be the point.
I'm going to turn it back over to Al. I made this point with Senator Bennett. I've been swapping phone calls with Senator Warner. I'd make the same one to him, but I'll just make it to you publicly. You're right. We don't have a majority. We can't pass anything, but we can make them vote on things. Make
Absolutely.
them vote to return the power of tariffs to Congress. Make them vote on the ethics code for the president. Get people and say, okay, you don't want to do this. We're going to make you take votes.
And that's exactly what's happening. In fact, Tim Kaine is going to have a vote. We're looking for what are called privilege resolutions that we can bring to the floor without the say-so of the majority leader. Tim's bringing up one next week to require the State Department to give us a human rights analysis of El Salvador. We'll see how they vote on that one.
Right. Okay. Well, that's my advice to the senators. Maybe you can't pass anything, but you can make them vote on stuff, and they're going to squirm. You know, way back then, Albert.
Senator, among your areas of expertise are armed services and intelligence. You served on those committees. You voted against Hegseth and Tulsi Gabbard. You've seen them now. You were talking about cuts. They are cutting the intelligence force. Hegseth is changing the military force. Is that endangering national security?
I think it is. I think, intelligence, if you go back to the sort of national security disasters of Vietnam and Iraq, they were based upon bad intelligence. That the intelligence of what was really happening on the ground wasn't getting through. I went back a year or so ago and reread The Best and the Brightest, David Halberstam's brilliant book about Vietnam. And the part of the problem was that the intelligence was being cooked to suit the demands of McNamara and Johnson. Same thing with Iraq when they were telling President Bush that there were weapons of mass destruction. So cutting the intelligence community and cutting their capacity to analyze problems is a real loss. Here's an interesting one. Every year at the Intelligence Committee, we have something called the Worldwide Threats Hearing. And every year, the leadership of the intelligence community and all the agencies come before the committee, and they produce a report about here are the things that are dangerous in the world that are causing us problems. I think every year for like the past 7 or 8 years, climate change has been one of the threats because it leads to migration, it leads to famine, it leads to instability. It's a threat multiplier in terms of national security. Guess what? This year, it wasn't in the report at all. Zero, gone. So that's an example of politics and ideology snuffing out intelligence that can be important in terms of making the country more secure. And the other piece in the Pentagon, of course, they're talking about 8 or 10% reduction. And what bothers me about that is if you start with a number, that almost tells you in advance that it's not a rational process. If you want to reduce the size of the bureaucracy, which I'm not necessarily against, it should be done by an analysis of which jobs are important, which are not so important, who's doing their job, who's productive, who's not. But when you start at the beginning and say we're going to reduce by 8%, almost by definition, you're not going to have a rational process to get there. And, firing probationary officers all throughout the government, that's like telling people to count off by threes. I'm a 1, 2, 3. Okay, all you twos are fired. I mean, it made no sense. And it's actually, I think, going to cost us more money than it's going to save.
Yeah, I think you're right. Let me go back to Margaret Chase Smith. McCarthy wreaked damage for almost 4 years after her amazing speech on the Senate floor. I have a good friend, Larry Tye, who wrote a terrific biography of Joe McCarthy, and he reminds us that his reign of terror ended in 1954, but the damage lasted for decades. Do you think the damage that Trump is inflicting now is going to take that long or longer to recover from?
I'm afraid I do. It depends, Al, on whether there's any effort made to stop it now rather than wait until another election or even 3 years from now. I think that's the real That's the real question, and the jury is out on that. Well, my colleagues finally wake up and realize that this isn't politics as usual. Listen, I don't care if the Archangel Gabriel is the president. They shouldn't have this kind of power. And the Republicans are going to regret it if there's a Democratic president, and the principle has been established that, you can ignore congressional appropriations, and you don't have to, you can abolish an agency created by Congress. All of those things are dangerous. Whoever's in the job, we can debate the president's agenda. I don't agree with much of it, but we can debate it. It's the way he's going about it, by circumventing the constitutional checks and balances, the rule of law. And now, he's had an outstanding unanimous Supreme Court decision for about a month on this guy in El Salvador, and basically they're just ignoring it. Yeah. So, that's the other leg of the triangle here is the courts, and they're doing a pretty good job of stepping up. But the question is, are these folks going to obey those decisions? And, it's pretty awful when they're talking about impeaching judges. No, I'm a lawyer. If you don't like the decision, you appeal it. You don't impeach the judge.
Right. You're a terrific communications person. Matt Fellane warned me, don't ask him questions about partisan politics. That's not what he's into. But I do have one. Do you have a favorite candidate for governor of Maine next year?
Well, there's some guy who has a similar name to mine. Actually, my son is running for governor, and it's pretty cool. His motto is, "I'm the Angus King who was born in Maine," which I think is sort of a smart comment. But yeah, he's a good guy. He just announced last week, and he's off and running. He's serious about it.
And he's running as a D.
That's correct.
I'll tell you something. I'll go campaign with him with the Cajuns in northern Maine.
There you go. They are up at, that's right, in Madawaska and Fort Kent. That's who we got up there is the Cajuns.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I'll show up and go campaign with him in a general election.
All right.
So I have just one thing before I let you go, Senator. You were 2 times governor of Maine. You've been senator for a while. You've studied and you've observed American politics. You're very in tune with history of the country. And I keep hearing and keep believing this is the worst. Actually, I'm more scared. I'm 80 years old. I was born the same year you were, 1944. I was born October 25th, which was the date of the first kamikaze attack at Lady Go. I have never been more afraid for our country than I am now, ever, in my 80 years, which is about the same time as you. Yeah. Do you think that myself and people that feel like that are justified, that the whole thing could just blow a gasket the way we're going?
I think it's the most serious assault on the Constitution in the history of the country. The Civil War was a division of the country. That was certainly the most serious crisis the country's ever faced. But in terms of the structure of the Constitution, the way it works, checks and balances, the protections that the framers built in, I think it's the most serious challenge we've ever faced. And that's what I'm trying to wake my colleagues up. And like I say, James, everybody's treating this as politics as usual. They say, well, King is just trying to undermine Trump, or Schumer's trying to undermine Trump. This is a qualitatively different situation than an argument about immigration or voting rights or guns or whatever it is. By the way, James, if anybody asked you, which they asked me when I was running last year, you should tell them you're a year younger than Mick Jagger. That worked for me, man. So now I know I've been verified that I have really good reason to be really scared. Yeah, I'm afraid so. It is a very serious moment, and what worries me is that it will take some real catastrophe to wake people up. I've been in touch with my Republican colleagues one by one, and they basically say, well, it's a problem, but the courts will take care of it, or, we'll get through this. This isn't typical. This isn't normal. And speaking of normal, what should scare us is that dictatorships, pharaohs, kings, czars, emperors, that's normal in world history. What we have is an anomaly. What we have is a very unusual blip in history that's lasted a couple of hundred years, but it's not assured by any means whatsoever. And if we start to allow all power to devolve into one set of hands, that's a sure recipe. Well, Madison summed it up. He said, when you have legislative, executive, and judicial power in one set of hands, that's a perfect description of tyranny. He used the word tyranny. He didn't mince words. And he said, liberty can't survive if you have legislative and executive power in one set of hands. We ought to be listening. History, our framers, the Constitution are shouting at us that this is a dangerous moment.
Well, thank you, Senator. I can't wait to have you one of the most insightful people in American politics. And all you people that come up to the airports and say, Mr. Carville, I'm really afraid. I'm going to say Senator King is too. So you got company out there and you have reason to be afraid.
Well, I also want to ask, just urge everyone out there. We're making reading assignments today. Read Angus King's Declaration of Conscience following on Margaret Chase Smith 75 years ago. Wonderful speech he gave in the Senate just a few days ago. It's easily accessible, and everybody out there ought to read it. Senator, thank you very much.
You so much,
and I'm glad to know Maine finally has a chance to vote for a king who was born there.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, I got to tell you, before we sign off, I was at one of the big hands-off rallies the other day up in Maine, and somebody had a sign that said, we don't vote for kings. No, we don't want kings except Angus and Stephen. I really like that one. Anyway, thanks so much, fellas. Great to be with you.
Thank you.